Hey, good morning. Hello, how are you? Greetings from Atlanta, Georgia. For today's first AP Virtual U.S. History lesson, we're going to cover 8.1, the topic of contextualizing period 8. And I'm going to go a little bit more in depth, but first I would like to introduce myself. My name is Miss Farr, and I am at Cambridge High School in Milton, Georgia. That is by way of Atlanta. And if you know anything about Atlanta, we are a home of 1,000 Waffle Houses, as well as sports teams like the Falcons, the Hawks, the Braves, and Atlanta United. I am super excited to join you guys, and hopefully you'll have this journey with me as we kind of cover the rest of the final two periods of your classwork. And then we're going to jump into some review. So it's going to be myself and Mr. Scott Horton, who are going to be your virtual AP instructors for this AP virtual classroom. So let's go ahead and jump right in. So just like a normal classroom, I love to start off with a warm up. And a warm up, of course, is just the same as a bell ringer. So it really just depends on what you guys call it. But just to kind of give you an idea of where we're going with the lesson and things that you should have already learned from your teacher. So since we're in period 8, this warm up is going to kind of be an overarching idea. So let's talk about contextualizing. First of all, contextualizing is the skill that involves the ability to connect historical events and processes to specific circumstances of time and place, as well as a broader regional, national, or global processes. So in other words, it is the big picture, everything that has happened, everything that has been covered in US history up until this point. So period 8, of course, starts in 1945 and it goes into 1980. So here's our question. What do the following presidents have in common? This is Presidents Monroe, Presidents Truman, and Presidents Eisenhower. Now, you may or may not have covered Truman or Eisenhower as of yet, but if you've already covered Monroe, so kind of tie it all together and think. So I'm going to give you a few minutes to think about the question. Okay, so here's one possible answer that you can get. Each president had a doctrine that pretty much addressed how the United States would deal with foreign affairs. Now, although each president was in a different time, Truman and Eisenhower was more the 20th century. Monroe, of course, was the 1820s. Their responses will be a little bit different depending on the time period in which we're talking about. So the question is, if we're talking about the topic of contextualization, how can you further elaborate on their policies in order to make a connection? Well, I told you guys to think about the big picture. So here's some way. Remember, the Monroe Doctrine addressed the idea of the United States as a very small country, still kind of finding its footing. And it basically just requested that foreign countries stay out of our hemisphere. And in return, we'll stay out of your hemisphere. Um, at that time, he was trying to address the fact that there was a lot of additional colonization that was happening inside of the Western Hemisphere. The United States was a big, huge fan of countries getting their independence, especially the colonies, considering that we had just gotten our independence from Britain. So Monroe was trying to address those concerns. In other words, all of those former, European countries that were there, they do not need to remain in that hemisphere. Allow those countries to operate as their own independent nations. When we look at the Truman Doctrine, when you talk about the Cold War tomorrow, one of the things you need to kind of think about is, what was he talking about? What was the need for the doctrine? We're talking about the spread of communism. We are talking about the fact that how do we possibly stop communism from spreading? You're going to look at the policy of containment and what the United States response to that was. And then, of course, when you look at Eisenhower and you're making that connection to both Truman and Monroe, still dealing with foreign affairs, still trying to stop certain foreign countries from invading and coming into other countries without their permission. He is going to kind of continue that policy of containment, but his doctrine is a little bit more aggressive. And basically what he says is, while we will provide assistance, both political and economic, is what Truman said. Eisenhower says a country could come and request that a country could come and request economic aid and or military aid if it was feel like it's being threatened. So as you make your connections and think about what contextualization means in this point, remember, it's the big picture. It's being able to make that connection. So if this were a question that you had on your AP exam and it asks you to compare or to contextualize two of these presidents, even if you decided to do all three, there is a connection amongst all of them, even though they were presidents during different times. So let's look at our lesson overview for today, and let's kind of look at where we're going in this journey. So for contextualizing period 8, here are your expectations. You need to understand change and or continuity with preceding historical developments. So I kind of did that with you guys when I did the warm up, and I kind of talked about, going through Monroe, what his change, what his continuity was when we talked about with Truman, and I also kind of talked about the changes and the fact of, at that point, United States was just kind of staying in their hemisphere, but when Truman and Monroe and Eisenhower, were presidents, we had already established ourselves as a world power. So it was on a more global scale. The other expectation is understanding similarities and or differences with contemporaneous historical developments in different regions or geographical areas. When you look at the Cold War, you're going to look at the different responses that each one had. As you start looking at even domestic issues within period 8, for example, you're going to learn about the civil rights movement, how those things differed from up north versus the southern response. As far as skills, you're going to need to identify and describe a historical context for a specific historical development or process illustrated by historical evidence. So remember, all of these skills are things that you have already pretty much learned. We're just going to kind of continue on and further elaborate as we take the journey into period 8. So what do you need to know about period 8? This is just an introduction. So when I'm talking about the skill of contextualization and I'm introducing this to you, I want you to understand that this is picking up where period 7 left off. So of course, we ended period 7 with World War II, 1945, the bombing of Nagasaki and Hiroshima. Now we're going to talk about what the world thinks or what's happening after this point. So I like to kind of say there's 6 things you need to know about period 8. And don't worry if you don't get it right now. I'm going to bring it back up and kind of really emphasize the important things. But these are just kind of like the top 6 things that you will definitely hear as myself or Mr. Horton are going through our lessons. So number 1, the United States positioned itself as a global leader. What does that mean exactly? Well, it means that now that we have atomic weaponry, how does the world view us? Are we a threat? Are we a friend? We are talking about stopping the spread of communism. We want for nations to have the democratic nations. We want to kind of basically have them do more capitalism versus communism. We want to be seen differently than how we were viewed at the end of World War I, where we kind of made a plan, but then we weren't able to actually help implement that plan. So we want to kind of do things a little bit differently at this point. The second thing is that initially there was major American support for anti-communist foreign policy. What does that mean, anti-communist? How does that look? When we're talking about the policy of containment and we're talking about how do we stop the spread, how did that change? Why did some Americans actually start believing in the whole idea of the Communist Party? Because whether most people want to realize there were some Americans who actually did support the theory of communism. And then also too, those American businesses that had foreign ties in various countries. What was their responses? How did they feel having those anti-communist feelings when they were having business ties with countries that were actually practicing communism? So how did that support change? Did it change? What was the connection? Because if you recall, there was also some situations where we had those anti-communist feelings, although they weren't really identified as communist feelings at the end of World War I. The civil rights activists energized a new nationwide movement for racial progress. The civil rights movements, of course, we're talking about the 50s, the 60s, and then the 70s. But what a lot of people don't realize is that the civil rights movement has been a continuous thing. We are looking at the fact that this civil rights movement had started well before then in the 1800s. Well, actually, you can say that it started right at the beginning of Reconstruction. And so these movements, when you think about leaders like W.E.B. Du Bois, Booker T. Washington, Marcus Garvey, and then, of course, for period 8, we're going to be looking at Martin Luther King. We're going to be looking at Malcolm X. We're going to be looking at whole organizations like SNCC. We're going to be looking at CORE. We're going to be looking at the SCLC. How did that new movement make it a nationwide thing? What was different from the 1800s, the late 1800s up until now? 4, spurred by civil rights movements, other social movements advocated for their causes. We're going to see the Latino movement with the grape growers. We're going to see Asian Americans now who have, felt they felt the pains of what happened with everything that happened with Pearl Harbor, and how their rights were stripped away, and how they now want to come back and be recognized as the fact that they were Americans. We're going to talk about the Native Americans who have been in constant battle with the United States government for upholding promises that were made well before even the 20th century. And we're going to look at women's rights and the role of women, that transition from the Victorian to the 1920s woman, and then, of course, from the 1920s woman into World War II, and how that made a change at the end of World War II, where some women kind of wanted to become homemakers. You're looking at that transition from the 50s. And then also you're looking at the fact that some women were wanting to have the same equal rights as men, equal pay, better jobs. And so that feminist movement, it's really going to kind of become important. And then, of course, you have your gay and your lesbian movements as well, wanting to have recognition, wanting to have those same rights, and the marches and pride and things that are going to start. So all of these are going to be spurred by the African American civil rights movement, and we're going to notice that there are a lot of similarities in how these movements are going to kind of mirror the things that happened with the civil rights movement that happened in the 50s and the 60s. Number 5, in the 1960s, President Johnson's Great Society program attempted to use power of the federal government to eliminate poverty and end racial discrimination and promote social justice. What does that mean? The Great Society program, is it a continuation of the New Deal that happened with FDR? You will notice some similarities and some differences with that. You'll also notice that a lot of the Great Society programs that Johnson had put into place and how he wanted to use the role of the federal government are still happening today. What was the plan when he wanted to eliminate poverty? How did he use that to end racial discrimination as he signed certain bills that ended, things like the Voting Rights Act? And then, of course, promoting social justice, not just for African Americans, but also for Native Americans. That was also a part of the Great Society program as well. And then finally, in the 70s, the public grew increasingly distrustful of the government's ability to solve problems. Is it still racial problems? Yes and no, but also we're looking at environmental problems. We're looking at the fact that we're going to have new government agencies that are going to be adopted at this time. And by this point, we have Richard Nixon who's in office. And what is he going to do? He's going to create EPA, the Office of Environmental Protection, the Environmental Protection Agency, excuse me. Well, what is their role? Their job is to protect some of the same things. And when you look at the EPA, some of this is kind of stemming from thinking about the big picture here. Think about Theodore Roosevelt and how he was trying to do conservation methods along with the Sierra Club. So kind of keep these in mind as you're going through period 8, and just kind of know that while these are not all of the things that are going to be covered in period 8, we're going to cover even more than that, but these are just kind of the 6 major topics that you can expect to definitely see during that time. So the question is, how do we get to this point? How did we get to the point where we are a global leader? We are on the brink of a Cold War that will last for decades. How did people come to see us as that world power? And then how is it that while we're dealing with these foreign issues, there are still domestic issues that are still kind of bubbling over as well? So I like to kind of look at it as this. We look at World War I. the Great War, we had the introduction of new types of weaponry. We had chemical warfare. We also had the fact that America joined this war late. We were a major ally. We looked at the fact that we came up with a plan in order to bring nations together. We wanted to prevent another war from happening. We were seen as great leadership. And then, unfortunately, we were not able to join the League of Nations. However, we were still actually making loans to countries in order to help them revitalize. So at this point, we're kind of setting the trend for countries who are going to look for America as far as looking for economic aid or political aid. We also need to look at the Great Depression. It wasn't just an impact that happened here in America. This impacted the entire world. Remember, we were still providing economic aid to certain countries. More specifically, we were providing economic aid to Germany. However, when the stock market crashed and our economy began to crash as well, those loans had to stop. We also needed to get money back that we had put into the war from Britain and France and all those countries that we helped out who were the allies. So now we're calling in all of those payments because our economy is suffering. The Great Depression will lead to looking at leadership, the responses to the Great Depression from the Republican Party headed by Herbert Hoover, and how FDR came in and came up with the new programs called the New Deal, kind of exercising more strength within the federal government, providing more aid, something that was different. And again, the world is still watching because we are still being seen as that great world power, that great world leader. And then, of course, World War II is going to be the big one. The bombing of Pearl Harbor, the fact that we decided to join this war. At first, we were kind of staying hands away. We kind of looked at what happened. We're still in the middle of a depression. Our country is still suffering. But World War II is going to be very impactful, not just for our country. It helped end the depression, but it also made changes for African Americans. It also made changes for women who came out of their kitchens in World War I, and they're going to kind of do it again and come together in World War II. And also the fact that we now have new weaponry with atomic weapons. And so once all this happens, and then of course, the big thing is that countries that were at one point our enemies are now going to become our allies. That's all going to change at the end of World War II. So how do we get to this point where we're about to start the Cold War? The bombings, weapons, things that we have in our arsenal that we did not share immediately, but now the world knows because we had to use them to effectively stop a war. How is it that this Cold War, how is that going to impact us? How is it that we're going to be able to still have those same allies? And again, now those allies are now going to become our enemies. And there's going to be a whole system of distrust. And you're going to start to notice that people in the government are going to start kind of using that their power in order to flush out those individuals that they feel are going to be bad for government. So let's do a little guided practice as we're talking about the theory of contextualization. So I wanted to start off with, this is an SAQ, a short answer question. And so we're going to kind of go through this, each element, and kind of talk about it and break it down one by one. So in the first part, you're going to explain one way in which the United States involvement in world affairs changed from 1945 to 1960. So broad period. Again, we're going to look at the one way the United States involvement in world affairs changed between 1945 and 1960. And this can also tie into the bell ringer that we had when we talked about Presidents Truman and Eisenhower, because they're going to actually fall within this time period. So I'm going to give you a few minutes to think about it, and then I'm going to kind of go through and tell you some possible answers that you could have. Okay, so what can we say? We could talk about this. The United States established a new mutual defense treaties, such as the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, in 1949 with foreign countries. And again, when you start talking about the Cold War tomorrow, he's going to go more in depth and kind of talk about NATO and what its purpose was and how it was basically the countries coming together to decide to defend each other and kind of forming that collaboration. Another thing you could mention is that the United States pursued a policy of containment overseas, whereby it sought to stop the expansion of the influence of the Soviet Union and communism over foreign countries. And of course, this is going to come from the long telegram that happened with George Kennan and how he realized that communism exists. There's no point in trying to, we don't want to go into another war now that Russia knows that we have these weapons. So let's just practice this policy of containment. And again, you will definitely understand more about containment tomorrow and why this policy was the most important, because they were looking at fighting the Cold War and trying to suppress communism without having to actually wage another war. You could also mention the fact that the United States engaged in military interventions in foreign countries, such as the Korean War from 1950 to 1953. Again, vitally important. Now, when we talk about the Cold War, you're going to notice something. There was no actual fighting between the United States and the Soviet Union, which were the two major world powers who were actually fighting the Cold War themselves. But you will see that there will be U.S. intervention in other wars as they are trying to stop the spread of communism. And the Korean War is one of those examples. So you will see what I like to call various hot spots within the Cold War. And that Korean War would be one of them. And then you can mention the fact that United States formed a permanent military establishment for national defense through the National Security Act of 1947. What did that do? What did that entail? How did other countries respond to that? And then you could also go and talk about how the United States provided foreign aid to help rebuild countries that were devastated by the Second World War through programs such as the Marshall Plan. How do we plan to spend money? How do we get other countries to come in and spend money as well? What kind of economic aid did those countries need at the time? And then finally, you could look at the United States provided support for first the French in Vietnam, and then later the South Vietnamese government. And of course, this will kind of lead us into what will be the Vietnam War, which was the longest, I guess, hotspot within the Cold War itself. So again, all of these are plausible responses if you wanted to briefly explain one way in which the United States involvement in world affairs changed between 1945 and 1960. So let's look at another question. And again, this is a part of a short answer question, so this will be part B. This is briefly describe one difference between the United States involvement in world affairs between 1945 and 1960, and the United States involvement in world affairs between 1918 and 1940. So look at what we're saying. We're looking at differences, and you got two different time periods between 1945 and 1960, and then between 1918 and 1940. So take a few minutes. Okay, guys, let's go ahead and kind of look at this. Okay, so the United States avoided mutual defense obligations to foreign countries between 1918 and 1940. That was huge. Remember, we always had that policy of kind of, we're not going to get involved. We're going to kind of remain neutral. Those neutral acts that happened, that were put into place, the neutrality acts, they basically just said, we will do business with countries that are not engaged in war, but we're not in war ourselves. So we're just going to kind of remain away from that. But between 1945 and 1960, we made pledges to foreign countries, basically just saying, hey, if you feel threatened, If you need economic aid, if you want to stop the threat of communism from coming into your country, we will assist you in any way possible. Now, when we say for some countries, we did provide military aid, but it wasn't at the expense of pulling the entire country into the war. That's not really going to impact us until we look at the Vietnam War. And you'll kind of see what I'm talking about when we get there. The second thing you could mention, the United States refused to join the League of Nations after 1918. And although it was the brainchild of President Woodrow Wilson, Congress was more so upset with the fact that while, yes, they agreed that something like that needed to happen, he kind of overstepped the boundaries of the presidency and kind of put us in a position where we honestly could not get involved with the League of Nations. And so he didn't get permission from Congress. And so that was the reason why we refused to join. And of course, after 1945, it led to the formation of the United Nations. I think we learned by not joining the League of Nations that, of course, that was basically World War I was going to, in World War II was inevitable. I think we saw the threat. I think we looked at everything that happened from our non-involvement with the League of Nations and how all of the blame was placed on one country. And of course, that country rose to power and came back and waged war in 1939, Germany. And we're looking at the fact that we do not want that to happen again. And so we're going to create the United Nations. We're also going to invite those countries to become a part of the United Nations. And we're also going to help those countries that were most economically ravaged. We're going to help them the most. We don't want to have a repeat of what happened at the end of World War I to happen at the end of World War II. You could also look at that the United States insisted on debt repayment and placed restrictions on international loans in the late 1920s and 30s. Remember how I talked about how do we get to this point? And I talked about World War I and for the warm up. And I kind of talked about I'm sorry, when I went through the 6 things that we needed to know and I talked about, World War I, that's what I'm talking about. We actually wanted to be repaid for our role in all the weapons, all the food, all the clothing, everything that we provided as far as aid to the Allies, we wanted to have repayment back. And then, of course, we did put those loans out to Germany with the idea of helping them rebuild and establish their economy with the Weimar Republic. And of course, they were unsuccessful because of the fact that they were not strong enough to actually implement the democratic government that we hope that they would be able to do. And then you mentioned while between 1945 and 1960, the United States provided foreign aid funds to help countries to rebuild after the Second War. You're going to learn more about that with the Marshall Plan. All of this was, again, under this whole policy of containment, which means that we're going to invest. We're going to help these countries rebuild back. We're not just going to give them loans, but we're not going to be the only country to put money into these to this. As the United Nations, yes, we probably will put in a higher percentage, but we're going to get Great Britain involved. We're going to get France involved and all these different countries. If we're going to be a United Nations and we're going to talk about the spread of the spread of communism, how to stop that, then we're going to need to all kind of put forth efforts and put, the economic aid and the military aid involved as well. All right, and then the final part of this, which is part C, briefly explain one reason for the difference between the United States involvement in the world affairs between 1945 and 1960 and the United States involvement in world affairs between 1918 and 1940. So same time period, but again, remember, make sure when you're doing SAQs, read the question very carefully to see what it's asking you. So I'm going to give you guys a few minutes to kind of think about it. Okay. So one possible answer is the disillusionment with outcome of World War I and long-term policy traditions of neutrality in foreign affairs led to a rise in isolationist sentiment between 1918 and 1940. I'm going to repeat that. The disillusionment with the outcome of the First World War and long-standing policy traditions of neutrality in foreign affairs led to a rise in the isolationist sentiment between 1918 and 1940. And that kind of goes back to, again, us not wanting to get involved. Even with the fact that World War II had already started, we're still not going to get involved. We will still do we will still do business with countries. However, as far as the United States is concerned, we're isolating ourselves. We're kind of adopting that whole Monroe Doctrine ideal again, which is, we're going to remain in our hemisphere at this point and let you guys handle your business in your hemisphere. The other path you could say is while between 1945 and 1960, the U.S. intervention overseas was seen as crucial to preventing conflicts that could lead to warfare and protecting U.S. national security interests. You're going to see that especially a lot when you go deeper into the Cold War, when you look at us and as far as the Middle East with oil, you're going to look at everything that happens with the Suez Canal situation. So many different areas when we're looking at our involvement with the Korean War. And then, of course, the big involvement with the Vietnam War. So it's so many different areas in which the United States is, our involvement is going to be seen as crucial. And it's going to be kind of an expectation that we get ourselves involved with this because we are kind of going to be seen as the leader in order to stop the spread of communism. And then here's another possible answer that you could have. The government's fear of the spread of communism was principally focused on suppressing domestic political dissent between 1918 and 1940. So we knew that communism existed. This wasn't new. It wasn't practiced as much as it was going to be after the end of World War II. But we wanted to kind of keep it here in a domestic issue, domestic dissent. We weren't kind of looking at it as a foreign. We kind of looked at it as how is it going to impact our government? How can we stop it here? You're going to really remember to kind of think about it when I come back and talk to you guys on Friday about the Red Scare. It's not going to be the first time that we've had that threat of communism possibly rising within our country. It actually did happen at the end of World War I. And then while between 1945 and 1960, fear the spread of communism abroad focused in on preventing foreign nations, especially in Europe and East Asia, from falling under Soviet influence and empowering communist governments. Looking at the sphere of influence that happened with the Soviet Union and how they're going to manage to get major countries like North Korea, like North Vietnam, also like China, how all those countries are going to fall to communism. What can we do? Not just looking at the sphere of communism within our own nation, but looking at it on a much bigger impact. So again, that whole theory of contextualization, the big picture, we're no longer thinking of ourselves at this point. We're now thinking of the world. So we're kind of put on that whole big brother role, or if you remember from the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, we're going to be seen kind of like as the policing power at this point. So I want to make sure that you guys really understand when I talk about the idea of contextualization and how you're looking at the big picture and how we're thinking about everything that's about to happen, that happened in period 7, the events that I've mentioned that happened within that period and how it led us up to this point. And of course, all these events that are going to happen that we're going to talk about within period 8 that will lead us into period 9. Let's kind of do a little check for understanding. So, these are some multiple choice questions, and although you will not see them on your AP exam this year, it's still good to kind of keep our practice going. So with every multiple choice, as you know, there is going to be a stimuli that you will have, whether it's a passage that you have to read or passages. You may be looking at a political cartoon, you may be looking at a picture. It could be various things, but kind of keeping along the idea of contextualization. Please take a few minutes and read this passage and then answer the question, and we're going to come up with the best response. So I'm going to give you guys a few minutes. Okay, guys, so this passage is from the Southern Declaration on Integration. This happened in 1956, so this is during the Civil Rights Movement. It's very important when you have passages, primary sources or secondary sources, that you make sure that not only do you pay attention to the words that are being said, but you also pay attention to when the author, the who, the what, the when, the where, and the why. So here is your question. The author of the quote most likely directly attacks which one? A, decision makers in each of the three branches of government. B, the desegregation of the U.S. military. C, the doctrine of states' rights. Or D, the efficacy of using federal power to achieve goals. All right, and the correct answer is D, the efficacy of using federal power to achieve states' goals. And the reason why is because they were talking about the fact that the federal government was actually trying to promote racial equality in in American public schools and other vital institutions. And more specifically, if you think about this, this is a kind of a response to what happened in 1945 with Brown versus the Board of Education, which basically ended segregation within public schools. So that is why when you kind of think about that and looking at it, why D is the correct answer for this response. All right, here's another one. All right, I'm going to give you guys a few minutes to kind of read through there. Remember, don't forget to look at the bottom to see the dates and to see what type of document it is. Okay, so this is the Drums Committee for the Menominee Indians in 1971. And don't forget that this is, again, a part of the Native American civil rights movement where they were trying to fight for their social rights as well. And the correct answer for this, it says number 2, the quote above is A, requesting federal power to end racial discrimination. B, raising awareness of the prevalence and persistence of poverty. C, addressing issues of identity and social injustice. Or D, calling on the federal government to advance desegregation. The answer is C, addressing issues of identity and social injustice. And more specifically, this was kind of addressing the ways in which the federal government were treating the Menominee Indians capriciously and also unfairly. And it was also condemning its refusal to consider the importance of the identity of Native Americans. All right, guys, we have one more question to go through as we kind of talk about this. This is the Port Huron statement. So again, take a few minutes to read through. Okay, so this is 1962, the Port Huron Statement. This is Students for a Democratic Society. So again, kind of in the middle of various movements that were happening. So this question says the author of the quote most likely A, condemned violent protests, B, was satisfied with the social programs of the Great Society, C, supported conservative tax policies and economic deregulation, or D, assailed liberals for doing too little for racial injustice. The correct answer is D. And the reason why he believed that the liberal state had done way too little to solve the problem of racial injustice inside of the American society. They were among a very young group of white Americans who frequently put themselves in line to support the goals of the civil rights movement. So good job, you guys, if you got these all correct. And if not, don't worry about it. Remember, process of elimination, pay attention to the dates, pay attention to the time period. Again, the contextualization part of it, thinking about the overall picture. Remember, I said 1962, so we're in the middle of the civil rights movement. We're kind of moving into a different era because we're under Kennedy's presidency and how his response will be. So those are kind of things you need to think about when you're answering your multiple choice questions. So let's kind of summarize and debrief everything that we got so far. All right, so here are our key takeaways. Number one, the United States responded to an uncertain and unstable post-war by asserting and working to maintain a position of global leadership with far-reaching domestic and international consequences. Another thing you're going to get a takeaway from is that the new movements for civil rights and liberal efforts to expand the role of the government will generate a range of political and cultural responses. And again, as you're going through period 8, you will see exactly what I'm talking about. And then post-war economic and demographic changes had far-reaching consequences for American society, politics, and culture. So again, talking about the skill of contextualization. The other thing is how to contextualize by using various stimuli. We looked at we had a couple of some primary sources that we kind of looked at when we did this. And then of course, how to apply the skill of contextualization on your AP exam. When we talked about, again, if you had a question like a short answer question, we kind of went through those. And at the beginning, I kind of gave you an FRQ, or free response question, how you'll be able to tie those in. And so our learning objective, of course, is to explain the context of societal change from 1945 to 1980. We're going to go from not just dealing with domestic issues and kind of having that policy of isolationism, but now we're going to kind of go on a more global scale and start caring about other countries as well. So I've told you guys I bring this back up and I underline the things again for those 6 important things. And just very quickly, first thing you need to know, remember, the United States as a global leader. We're going to see that. It's going to be evident. You're going to see that more and more as we go through unit period 8. 2, American support for anti-communist policy. Definitely going to talk about that as you go through the Cold War tomorrow. And when I pick back up with you guys on Friday, we're going to talk about the impact that it will have on a domestic issues as far as the Red Scare is going to go. 3, the civil rights movement for racial progress. And we're going to learn, again, not just for African Americans, but for Latinos, Asian Americans, women's rights, gay, lesbian rights, and also for Native Americans, which kind of ties in number 4. So other social movements advocated for their causes, kind of looking at the civil rights movement, the televising, how the impact that it made and how it led to federal legislation. Can they get those same results? Number 5, the Great Society program attempted to eliminate poverty, end racial discrimination, and promote social justice. All of these things are going to be so pivotal, and you're going to see whether or not the Great Society did what it intended to do, or what type of impact it will have as far as the government is concerned. And then number 6, the public grew distrustful of the government's ability to solve problems. Were we talking about things that we're dealing with domestically? Are we talking about things that were foreign wise? Definitely domestic as far as the environment. And you're going to see that more often as we kind of go through this. When you get an opportunity, kind of thinking about the idea of contextualization, if you could, I know all of you guys have camera phones. I know you have the ability to scan QR codes, but kind of go onto YouTube and watch this video. If there was ever a video that I think would contextualize period 8 and everything that you guys are about to see and learn about, it would be this video right here. It's called We Didn't Start the Fire by Billy Joel. And I want you guys to just take a look at that video on YouTube. And they're going to go through all the years from 1945 up until 1980. And that's just the best example of contextualization that I can give you guys so that you can see it on a bigger visual scale. So really quickly, let's kind of go through a brief exam practice. Just kind of looking at this, during the years of 1945 to 1980, the Cold War fluctuated between periods of confrontation and peaceful coexistence. Briefly explain one policy or action that led to this confrontation. So if you guys were to have this on your exam, how would you answer this? Here are some possible answers that you can look at. We're not going to really we don't really have enough time to go into these, but remember when you're looking at questions like this, if they're free response, if they're SAQs, it's always good to create a giant list is what I'd like to recommend, because what you can do is once you get your list together, you can figure out which one you definitely know the best information about so that you can answer the question effectively and make sure that you are addressing what the question is asking you. So here are 8 things that you can talk about when you want to talk about, the Cold War fluctuated between periods of confrontation and peaceful coexistence. All of these things will kind of touch on that if you mention those. Part B, briefly explain one policy or action that promoted peaceful coexistence. And again, these are all things that promoted peaceful coexistence. United Nations, Détente, SALT I, SALT II, Geneva Accords, Paris Peace Talks, the kitchen debates. So again, kind of thinking along the lines of first create a list, let me see what I know, and then from there choose the one choose the one that you definitely know that you can probably give the best response to. And the reason why I like these questions and why they're so broad is that it does give you the opportunity to pick and choose which way you want to go, which direction you want to go with this. So if you feel better about talking about the kitchen debates that Nixon had, feel free to go through that. Talk about the kitchen debates. If you feel like you're more better, you have more information with the United Nations, then you have that option. So you're not limited to anything, to any one specific thing. You have 6 different options, and there's more options than this. I'm just giving you some options that you can decide from. And then finally, part C, one piece of outside evidence and explain how it supports your response in either A or B. Make sure when you're doing an SAQ, if you have something and it says, make sure that you read it out fully. Don't make the mistake of feeling like you have to answer parts A and part B. Remember, it says either part A or part B. So you do have that option and you only need to come up with one piece of evidence. And then here are some things that you can kind of talk about. If you want to talk about the nuclear arms race, you can cite NSC 68 or the National Security Report Council report in 1950. Let's just say if you want to talk about the Korean War, you could talk about the Truman Doctrine. Remember we talked about Truman with our warm-up? Here's your opportunity to address that and how the policy of containment to create peace. For the Vietnam War, again, Truman Doctrine is still applicable here. You could also talk about how we rejected the terms of the Geneva Conference in 1954. So again, only one of those things, and I kind of selected some things that can either address part A or part B. So as we close, I want to give you something to think about. Tomorrow you will be taught by Mr. Horton, who is going to talk to you about the Cold War. And this is actually the beginnings of this period. I was just kind of giving you a brief introduction and kind of talking about contextualizing, which means picking up things from period 7 and taking them over into period 8. I want you to think about this question. What is the point of view of Presidents Truman, Eisenhower, and Kennedy with regard to the buildup of American armed forces? Think about that. Presidents Truman, Eisenhower, and Kennedy, and how their point of view with regard to the American buildup of the armed forces. I really do appreciate you guys joining me today. I had such a great time, and I hope that I taught you enough to kind of get you started with this period. And thank you for watching, and I hope that you'll be joining us again. Please make sure that you think about that practice question that I asked you. Think about the points of view of Truman, Eisenhower, and Kennedy when it comes to American buildup. You guys have a great day. Thank you.